So now that the election is finally over, I have the gumption to present my results to my thesis, which was Perceived Trust of United States Politicians Through Prosody, aka why you probably enjoy Governor Whitmer of Michigan and Governor Cooper of North Carolina a lot more than you think, and why you probably detest Mayor Goodman of Las Vegas solely based on how grating her voice comes across. If you're just here for the results, feel free to skip ahead. I've divided this video into sections, so skip around to whatever section is relevant to whatever you're looking for. Or listen to the entire thing while you're multitasking, or what you're actually doing switch tasking. Whatever floats your boat. If you have any questions, feel free to ping me on Twitter. I'm fairly responsive on that medium. And now we embark upon our journey in the relevant literature. I've tried to make the background as brief as possible, but if you don't know what trust or prosody is, it's fairly difficult to take anything away from this work. So we'll go over some necessary definitions, and then continue on with the experiments I carried out, and what conclusions you can draw from this work. So what is trust? In business literature, trust is defined as a combination of predictability, value exchange, delayed reciprocity, and exposed vulnerabilities. The definition of the word from Old English referred to solid or lasting, and Chaucer used it to mean virtual certainty and well-grounded hope. Today we know that trust is essential in initiating and maintaining interpersonal relationships. It has often been referred to as the lubricant of social interaction, whereby trust becomes a combination of uncertainty, fragility, hope, and expectation. The truster creates a mental model of how trustworthy the trustee, so the individual who is trusted, is, and makes a decision based on this model. This modality of trusting is what we define as perceived trustworthiness, and is used to gauge judgments of explicit trust as opposed to implicit trustworthiness, which would be used to predict behavior. In this thesis, I focused on explicit trust, thus I was interested in how people felt about the person, not necessarily what actions they would take because of the level of trust they instilled in that individual. In psychology, researchers make a distinction between the types of trust a truster places in a trustee. These are cognitive and affective trust. Cognitive trust refers to the beliefs based on the opinions or knowledge about objects, meaning it's based on your experience or others' experience of the trusting behavior of that individual. Put simply, if they borrowed money from you in the past and paid you back, you're more likely to believe that person in the future, given it's in an economic context. Affective trust, on the other hand, throws logic and reasoning by the wayside. Instead, it refers to the influential emotional connection provided by the amount of care and concern the trustee shows towards you or other people. Reputation can be thought of as cognitive trust, and cooperativeness as affective trust. Prosody is a term used to describe a time series of speech-related information that is not predictable from a lexical window applied to a phenome sequence. So prosody refers to any type of channel for communication, carrying some amount of information that cannot be fully captured by the lexical channel. With this definition, prosody can also refer to hand gestures, facial expressions, and other types of body language since they communicate some amount of information that is not fully transparent in the lexical channel. In this work, however, I only focused on the auditory channel since I looked at sound bites and not video clips. Some prosodic elements in speech include intonational phrasing, so the division that's spoken text into chunks, accentual highlighting, the distribution of prominence across the text, pitch contours of targets, the specification of particular pitch patterns such as rises or falls, pitch span or range, so wide or narrow, local or global, tempo, fast or slow, pauses both filled and unfilled, rhythm, the regular occurrence of speech events in time, and voice quality, so creakiness, breathiness, and so on. A quick definition is prosody is referred to as the packaging of a sentence rather than the actual content itself. Prosody can create an impression, convey information about emotions or attitudes, or alter the meaning of language entirely. In politics, the rhetorical style used is often done so in a directly targeted manner. The persuader, often the politician, uses target-oriented rhetoric specifically for their audience. Tuioti explored how some of these rhetorical features translated into prosodic elements in the context of a pre-electoral television debate. In a follow-up study, Tuioti found that pitch variation is used when establishing a context between pre- and post-electoral speech, or a change between spontaneous speech and rehearsed speech, which is when someone is directly quoting someone else. Register change was also used when quoting the opposition. Tuiotti's work provided the foundation for future research of political prosody to investigate both register and pitch variation while conducting a rhetorical analysis. Recent political literature looks to these prosodic elements as a way of predicting voter outcomes. A number of studies using experimental and real-world electoral data found that candidates with lower-pitched voices win more votes. Researchers have argued that since deeper voices have shown to be associated with strength, dominance, muscularity, and masculinity, this preference provides evidence for the preference of deeper voiced leaders as they are looked upon to protect and prevail in times of war and conflict. A study with Klofstad found that conservative Republicans preferred lower-pitched voices than do liberal Democrats. I bring up SHIELD on this slide because they found something contradictory to most research in the field. They showed that mean F0, so fundamental frequency, was a pretty bad indicator for general or economic trust, but good for mating trust. They found that CV, which is standard deviation divided by the mean, was the most telling for their data for general and economic trust. So now we'll go into the 3 experiments conducted in this thesis, starting with the pilot study. I don't think I need to say anything about COVID, but the situation set the stage for large amounts of data being manipulated and a mass hysteria about who to trust and why. In 1984, Britain passed the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, which altered how police interactions and interviews were administered. Rather than police merely listening to a story, writing up a police report, and having both parties sign the report, the entire exchange was now to be recorded via audio recorders. This act was put in place to stop potential verbaling, putting words into someone's mouth, from occurring during police interviews to help mitigate wrongful convictions taking place. However, this act turned out to be more useful than the government had originally intended because it carved the way for the art of forensic listening. While the government was interested in what people said, it was rather the sonic textures in the environment that provided more clues to the police's investigation than any of the semantic content that was being exchanged. Police began calling on linguists and phonologists to decipher if the background noise in a recording was a gunshot or someone slamming a door. This legislation initiated the movement that governs our speech today. Our speech is legally accountable in all places, no longer masked behind a paper's accounts of our words. It's not only what we say that matters, but how we say it and where that also determines how people interpret our speech. With the amount of misinformation being spread about COVID-19 online and within our own friend groups, who can we trust? Which numbers are correct? Should these individuals be liable for deliberately falsifying data? Why do we pick a particular news station to listen to for our current updates? Do we trust the source because of the name, because we grew up listening to it, or is it something completely different? This experiment was designed to determine what intrinsic audio cues or sonic cues United States residents listened for to determine the speaker's perceived trustworthiness. There were a total of 161 participants in the study gathered by snowball sampling. Posts were made on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn to gather a more diverse and representative sample. The only requirement for participating in the survey was that the participant answered all the required questions and reached the final screen before terminating the website. All 50 United States governors' voices were used in the study. Recordings were gathered from YouTube, governors' websites, and news agencies' websites. The video clips were played back through a complete Audio 6 and recorded in Ableton Live 10. Some of the clips were only uploaded to the respective distribution service using 1 instead of 2 channels of audio. Thus, while recording, each track was converted to mono instead of stereo. Each soundbite was processed using a declipper, a noise remover, de-esser, plosive remover, and compressor in that order. This processing was necessary to ensure that each soundbite was as close to one another in terms of background noise, loudness, and clarity to reduce the possibility for confounding variables significantly impacting the results of the survey. Each clip was between 30 and 45 seconds long and included some semantic content regarding their respective states' COVID numbers and reopening procedures. Each clip was also gathered between April 20th and April 24th, which was after the White House released their guidelines on reopening procedures for that state. These dates are important to note since each state governor had ample time to discuss their reopening procedures and come up with a viable plan for the future. The soundbites were gathered in the first press conference for each state after the guidelines were announced and a plan for each state began to materialize. The first question posed was about state residency. The answer to this question was used to curb potential bias towards the individual's own governor. That governor was then removed from the list of potential soundbites. Participants were then instructed to rate 6 randomly selected sound bites, 3 female and 3 male, on 3 questions. 1. How trustworthy does the speaker sound? 2. How likely is it that this person will provide you with factual information about the COVID-19 pandemic? And 3. How likely is it that this person will provide you with factual information during a natural disaster? In terms of vocal profiles for all the governors, I'll probably get the question of, doesn't all this vocal processing alter the individual's voice? So I prepared an example where I'll play the raw audio, then processed audio, and you can tell the difference for yourself. The processing was done to remove extraneous noise that could significantly influence the speaker's vocal profile and not actually alter the speaker's voice at all. So here is the raw audio.
I left the protests in the street after taking a knee, after praying, and after addressing the crowd.
And now the processed audio.
I left the protests in the street after taking a knee, after praying, and after addressing the crowd.
So some musical information retrieval techniques were used to determine if the energy in the voice could be differentiated from one governor to the next. Zero crossing rate and spectral centroid were used, but showed no consistent correlations. The only correlation from this endeavor was that the large gaps between changes in energy were from a lack of dialogue. This was investigated further in both experiments to ensure that the phonation time, the amount of time the person spoke during the soundbite, was not directly correlated to how trustworthy the speaker was rated. Mean F0, range, standard deviation, speech rate, articulation rate, average syllable duration, phonation time, and duration were all studied for possible correlations. Since so few voters ranked male governors, it would be useless to perform statistical tests on these correlations. Even if statistical significance was demonstrated, the actual significance of these correlations would be absent. So the 3 metrics that seemingly had correlations were articulation rate, phonation time, and standard deviation, with standard deviation being the most correlated with the perception of trustworthiness. So I've highlighted that in this slide. Since I wanted more ratings for fewer governors, I decided to pick the top 2 highest trust and 2 lowest trust governors to move on to experiment 1. And the trust ratio is the number of positive to negative results. The only governor here that you'll see that wasn't in the graph with all of the speech attributes is Iowa. We'll see that she is still lower than the high trust, but instead falls somewhere in the middle of everyone. So now we'll go on to experiments. Experiment 1 is a direct continuation of the pilot study, except instead of 50 governors, I parsed it down to the 8. This time I used 2 participant groups, Snowball and Amazon Mechanical Turk. In both groups, participants were required to be 18 years or older and a current United States resident. The AMT group was compensated with the minimum wage for the United States, while the Snowball group wasn't paid at all. 94 participants were used for AMT, whereas 91 participants were used in the Snowball sample. The sound bites remained the same, but the questions were parsed down from 3 to 2. I removed the natural disaster questions since it seemed like there was no difference between COVID and the natural disaster answer. Instead of 6 sound bites, though, the participant only answered trust questions about 4 of them. Likert scale remained the same. An essential item to note is that the study deviates from the surrounding literature and that most other studies eliminate this confounding variable of semantic content by having the individuals say the same word or phrase, so hello for example. Due to the nature of the COVID-19 pandemic, real soundbites were used from governors during press conferences. The chosen soundbite was at the discretion of me, meaning potential bias could have been injected into the study unknowingly. Rather than rating all the governors based on their prosody, participants may have instead rated these politicians on the validity and practicality of their reopening procedures. All soundbites were chosen to include some amount of reopening plans, be it that the state was opening or remaining closed. But again, bias could have been introduced in this manner. To account for this bias, a semantic analysis was conducted using the Stanford Core NLP library. An individual's prosody is also known to change dramatically from spontaneous speech to rehearsed narratives. Soundbites were selected based on rehearsed speech patterns, so they were reading from a script, to eliminate the issues that arise from comparing different types of speech. However, while the governors were reading their speeches, they may have ad-libbed, so injected some spontaneous speech, and therefore changed their prosody throughout the clip. I did not account for this directly, but instead I counted the number of ums or uhs in speech to indicate just how frequently a governor may have injected their own thoughts and opinions into the rehearsed speech. The results from this relationship between the types of potential bias and trustworthiness measures are presented in the following slides. So the next three tables show the frequency distribution for the two population pools together, the snowball population and the AMT population. Each of these tables shows the number of people who voted for each governor in each category and some statistical parameters, so interquartile range, median, and mode. The cells highlighted in red are the statistically significant numbers. So this is just for the snowball sample, and these results are from the AMT sample. The stacked bar charts are ordered exactly the same for the lowest 5 governors, but for the upper 3 they tend to change order, yet all remain in the same top 3. Upon taking a closer look at the difference between the AMT sample and the snowball sample, it is evident that the AMT sample rankings were not spread as far as those in the snowball sample. This represents that individuals in the AMT group tended to rate the governors as higher overall compared to the snowball sample. However, in both samples, it is evident that there is a clear distinction between the highest rated and lowest rated governor. Once again, this is for the total participants. So you can see the general trend upwards. This is for the snowball sample. And these results are for the AMT sample. To determine if any of the same correlations for articulation rate, phonation time, or standard deviation held true, Pearson's R, Spearman's R, and a two-tailed t-test with unequal variances were calculated. Pearson's R measures the linear relationship between two continuous variables, whereas Spearman's R evaluates the monotonic relationship between rank values. Since the data is Likert type and not Likert scale, so taking a mean does not necessarily provide us useful data, we assume that our data may not have a linear relationship. In monotonic relationships, the variables change together, but not necessarily at a constant rate. Most literature in this realm uses one-tailed t-tests, because the authors are testing a specific hypothesis. So, for example, does higher mean F0 indicate higher trust in economic or mating contexts? And therefore, they know the direction they wish to test. A one-tailed t-test allows researchers the ability to look more directly at a relationship. Since my study is testing correlations, not necessarily directions of correlations for the parameters we're looking at, we are not making any assumptions as to the direction of that relationship. A two-tailed t-test is an appropriate way to explore these types of relationships. The Pratt analysis and corresponding statistical tests for each metric are presented in the following two tables for answers to the general trust and COVID question, respectively. For the general trust query, the range, standard deviation, and articulation rate were found to be statistically significant in all three tests. The highest correlation value for either the Spearman or Pearson correlation coefficient came from the count, which checked for the number of times a person said or during their soundbite. And once again, the cells in red were statistically significant values. For the COVID question, the two parameters found to be significant across all three metrics were range and articulation rate, with the count once again being the highest correlation value for Spearman and Pearson. Phonation time and standard deviation were close to being statistically significant as well, but were slightly below the required value. From these results, we can draw hypotheses regarding which prosodic elements correlate directly to governors' perceived trustworthiness. We were able to replicate the results found in the pilot study for how each governor was ranked on the trust ratio. It remains unclear what metric has the most influence on the independent variable, the perceived trust, based on so few vocal profiles. Still unclear is the distinction between general trust and COVID trust, high-stress trust, rankings. The two values were nearly identical for all 8 governors. So experiment 2 builds on the results found here, but uses mayors as the stimuli rather than governors. Experiment 2 builds on experiment 1 in that similar questions are posed to listeners at a time when civil unrest and data manipulation of current events are extremes. Rather than concentrating on COVID-19, however, this experiment focuses on mayors' responses to protest on police brutality. Protest and civil unrest ensued after the death of George Floyd on May 25, 2020. The 1984 Police and Criminal Evidence Act, mentioned previously, indirectly helped start these protests as a bystander was the one who recorded the incident. Without this video, the police report would have given an entirely different narrative as to what happened. Although not all states require body cameras to be worn, citizens are now taking initiative to record all encounters with police to help validate their testimony. The responses from both federal and state governments to these events were either appalling or adequate, depending on which news source captured the event. Once again, the United States public was faced with a great deal of misinformation and misframing of the events. How does a constituent determine whom to trust for accurate portrayals of these events? Do they stay with the same rhetorical prosody from their favorite news station, or are they now turning to a different news source because the broadcast sounds informed? How can a person trust the information that is being disseminated? Same two participant groups. The AMT group was compensated with the minimum wage for the US, while the snowball sample was not paid at all. 93 participants were used for the AMT sample, whereas 88 participants were used in the snowball sample. 8 United States mayors' voices were used in the study, including Los Angeles, Phoenix, Chicago, New York, Houston, Las Vegas, Oklahoma City, and San Antonio. These 8 mayors were determined based on the nature of the BLM movement. Police killing data gathered between January 2013 through December 2019 was analyzed, and the top 8 cities for the highest total number of police killings were chosen. These soundbites were gathered after June 1st, thus after the autopsy on Mr. Floyd showed that his death was a homicide, and some protests around the country were starting to turn violent. The first question posed was about state residency. The answer to this question was used to curb potential bias towards their own mayor. That mayor was then removed from the list of potential soundbites. Participants were then instructed to rate 4 randomly selected soundbites on 2 questions. 1. How trustworthy does the speaker sound? And 2. How likely is it that this person will provide you with factual information regarding the protests on police brutality? From the tables, we see that there's a slight difference in the way in which the snowball sample and the AMT sample voted for perceived trustworthiness. For the snowball sample, it was evident that Chicago, Las Vegas, and Oklahoma City were all voted significantly lower than the rest of the group. For AMT, however, the rankings differed for general trust and protest trust questions. The AMT and snowball sample group ranked similarly when rating on the question of protests, but differed slightly when ranking on general trust. The most noticeable difference was how the populations voted for the mayor of Oklahoma City. Just a quick note on him, I could only find a soundbite for this mayor where he used spontaneous speech rather than rehearsed speech. Some raters may have found the ums or uhs in his speech indicative of low general trust, but high protest trust, since the semantic content he provided demonstrated logical reasoning. So this is the result for the total number of participants. These were the results for the snowball sample. And these are the results for the AMT sample. The stacked bar graphs help illustrate the differences in rankings and perhaps provide some amount of explanation as to why the rankings are different. For the AMT sample, the 3 female mayors had more very untrustworthy rankings than any other mayor in the sample. This severely skewed the rankings for the mayor of Phoenix, who was ranked in the top highest 3 mayors by the snowball sample. The AMT sample, as in Experiment 1, ranked every mayor higher overall. Despite some discrepancies in the middle rankings, it is evident that Houston's mayor had ranked number 1 overall, and Chicago and Las Vegas were the 2 lowest ranked mayors. So this is for the snowball sample. And this is for the AMT sample. The Pratt analysis was also done on the mayor's soundbites. For the general trust query, the mean and standard deviation were statistically significant in all 3 tests. The highest correlation value for either the Spearman or Pearson correlation coefficient came from standard deviation. From the protest question, the 2 parameters found to be significant across all 3 metrics were again the mean and standard deviation, with the count being the highest correlation value for Spearman, slightly over its standard deviation, but standard deviation being the highest for Pearson. Although it remains unclear why the 2 populations ranked some mayors differently, it was evident that the demographics were drastically different between the 2 populations. After analysis, it was found that individuals aged 18 to 29 on average ranked both governors and mayors as less trustworthy overall than any other age group. Heterosexuals on average ranked both governors and mayors as significantly more trustworthy than did participants who identified as non-heterosexual. Black participants on average ranked governors and mayors as high trust. Taken together, since the AMT population had far fewer participants aged 18 to 29, fewer participants that identified as non-heterosexual, and had significantly higher black demographic. AMT rankings were higher overall for the mayors as expected. Again, these demographics may not represent the real meaning behind why the two populations differed, but they do provide hypotheses to investigate further. For these results, we can draw hypotheses regarding which prosodic elements correlate directly to mayors' perceived trustworthiness. We are able to replicate results showing that people trust certain voices over others. We replicated that standard deviation is highly correlated to perceived trustworthiness, but no other parameters were found to be as highly correlated. It remains unclear as to what, if any, distinction exists between general trust and protest, so high-stress trust, since the responses for each mayor were nearly identical. We saw from the previous experiments that standard deviation is the metric that best describes the differences in perceived trustworthiness for both the governors and the mayors. This table shows the prosodic elements of all the governors and mayors used in Experiment 1 and Experiment 2, ranked by their perceived trustworthiness ratio, so the number of positive to negative responses, for general trust. For the general trust category, we found that there were no prosodic elements that were statistically significant in all three categories. Rather, every one of them, besides the count, was statistically significant for the t-test. Articulation rate, average syllable duration, and duration were statistically significant for the Spearman coefficient, and the standard deviation and range were statistically significant for the Pearson coefficient. As for the situational trust answers, all prosodic elements were statistically significant for Spearman except the mean F0, and all prosodic elements were statistically significant for the t-test except the count. No prosodic element ended up being statistically significant for the Pearson coefficient, but the standard deviation had the closest value to one that was. It remains a question of which parameters or combination of parameters best describe perceived trustworthiness. Throughout these three experiments, including the pilot study, it is clear that standard deviation and its close neighbor range plays some role in trust perception. To investigate this correlation more in depth, the next two figures depict the relationship between the trust ratio and standard deviation for both general and situational trust. From these two graphs, we can see a clear negative relationship between the two variables with Governor Whitmer of Michigan as the outlier in the top right portion of each graph. If we remove this outlier, we see that this relationship is even stronger than before, and our almost statistically valid correlations for standard deviation would most certainly be significant now. Governor Whitmer is considered an influential point, but is that the case because of the lack of vocal profiles with very high standard deviation, or is this truly an outlier in our data? Another question to ask is why trust rankings tend to go down after 15 Hz or so if the relationship is truly a negative correlation. If this were the case, the trust ratio should be higher while the standard deviation is low and keep decreasing as the standard deviation increases. Since we see a bend in the beginning, is there possibly another bend at the end? To further investigate this query, vocal profiles for governors in the pilot study were plotted on the same figures to illustrate where they might lie on the trust ratio versus standard deviation relationship. This data from the pilot study is not necessarily exactly how the governors would have ranked overall, but since Experiment 1 confirmed our rankings in the pilot study, we will assume that the other rankings would remain similar and use this data to better postulate this relationship. These next two figures demonstrate what the relationship between trust ratio and standard deviation looks like with governors from the pilot study and Experiment 1 and mayors from Experiment 2. We see the additional governors mapped directly onto our relationship in both the general and situational trust. Notice how Governor Cooper of North Carolina also has an extremely high standard deviation in his soundbite, and his trust ratio remains high. Governor Whitmer is no longer an anomaly, and the trust ratio arc for a standard deviation of about 10 to 35 Hz is even more prominent than it was previously. These four additional governors help strengthen the argument that standard deviation plays an essential factor in trust perception. However, the two governors with high trust and high standard deviation have yet to be determined as part of our population or merely influential points. And this is just the same graph, but just for the general trust query. To help validate our claims that these two governors might be part of the population rather than influential points or outliers, 4 famous speeches in United States history were used as voice samples. Each sample was recorded and edited using the same hardware and software as previously mentioned. The speech analysis was performed in the same manner as the other soundbites. These speeches include John F. Kennedy, his inauguration speech, Martin Luther King Jr., the I Have a Dream speech, Richard Nixon, Nixon's first Watergate speech, and Bill Clinton, his I did not have sexual relations with that woman. No survey was needed for these prominent historical figures, since we know how constituents perceived them during the time of their speech. MLK, JFK, and Bill Clinton were all perceived as high trust. MLK and JFK were considerably higher trust than Bill Clinton, however. At the time of Clinton's speech, many people still supported the claim that he did not have sexual relations with Miss Lewinsky. On the other hand, Richard Nixon was perceived as low trust, since his reputation was so poor that he actually had to resign from office. Since there was no way to measure the trust ratio for high trust or low trust without a survey, the first and third quartile of the survey data for trust rankings was used to denote low and high trust, respectively, in both general and situational trust scenarios. The next two figures denote the relationship with the governors from both the pilot study and experiment 1, mayors from experiment 2, and the prominent historical figures mentioned previously. In both the general and situational trust scenarios, we see that the historical figures map directly onto a relationship. MLK and JFK have extremely high standard deviations and would have the highest trust ratio out of the four figures. From their additions to the graphs, it seems as if Governor Whitmer is less of an outlier now and is part of a trend where extremely high trust is often denoted by an extremely high standard deviation in the voice. Richard Nixon has a standard deviation of closer to 30 Hz and fit along the graph with low trust, exactly how the governors and mayors had aligned. Clinton had a standard deviation of around 20 Hz and also fit in the cluster of highly ranked governors and mayors around the same standard deviation. These newly added figures beg the question, why do we see a negative correlation between trust ratio and standard deviation up until a certain point? I posit that we experience an uncanny valley, as they denote it in virtual reality literature, in the modulation of pitch, so the standard deviation from the speaker. If you know VR literature, you'll be familiar with this nomenclature. There seems to be a curve up from 0 Hz to 20 Hz, dropping down around 30 Hz and rising back up at 35 Hz. In VR, this uncanny valley refers to when objects or items in the environment are real, but not quite real enough. We usually see a positive correlation between the realism of the environment and immersion scores, to better immerse the user into the VR and create a more realistic environment. However, there's a significant downward slope where the low fidelity environment or appearance is actually more immersive than the current one. So to better explain the stance, think about early voice assistants and how unnatural they sounded. Most of them were incredibly monotone, so low standard deviation, and the pitch inflections were divergent from that of normal conversation. This point helps illustrate why speakers with low standard deviations had a slightly lower perceived trust ranking. Something perhaps sounded a bit off, or the person made no expression through their voice. Although they were not rated lowest trust, they were also not rated as the highest trust. As we progress further towards higher standard deviations, we see this decline in trust ratio. I posit that we see this trend because people with this amount of standard deviation in their soundbite were often convincing, but not convincing enough. Rather than approaching the speech from that of an inclusive standpoint, it may have sounded a bit forceful or overall a little jarring. Recall a moment where a person's retelling of a story was less than convincing because they had dramatic pitch modulation such as, "Well, anyway, we went to the store and you won't believe what happened." These individuals display a pitch modulation that is higher than average speech, but not as high as the last category, which I call the preacher cluster. These orators use rhetorical prosody to not only convince their listeners of the argument, but also in a way that resonates with the majority of people. Preachers often speak in this manner: high standard deviation, low speech rate, and often a higher mean of 0. The cluster of governors and historical figures, so no mayors actually fell into this category, display these qualities in their voice sample. These qualities seem to emote a feeling of being talked to rather than being talked at. This inclusive nature may be the reason some people rate these voices as high perceived trust. However, I posit that this curve will fall off around 47 to 50 Hz because the pitch modulation would just be way too much for the listener. This kind of modulation would sound as if the person was singing rather than speaking and create another jarring reaction. For some individuals with autism spectrum disorder, for example, their speech is described as sing-song and can lead to frustration when it comes to communication. On the other extreme, individuals with monotonic speech can also exhibit issues with communication, implying that low pitch modulation or standard deviation creates a perception of low trust as well. A final point that remains to be discussed is that of the difference between general trust and situational, so COVID-19 and protest trust. There was little distinction between general trust and the situational trust for all three experiments. Throughout this thesis, I argued that high-stress trust could be a different context to consider in the future of political prosody papers, but my results demonstrate that this is not entirely true. In Shield 2020, the authors demonstrate that when it comes to prosodic elements, general trust and economic trust are nearly identical. It is instead the mating context that drastically differs from the other two. I argue that high-stress trust, when it comes to prosodic elements in the voice, and trust behaves identically to economic trust. Therefore, the main contribution of this thesis is not that high-stress trust behaves similarly to economic trust. Rather, it is that the standard deviation does not behave linearly to perceived trust. In most studies in this field, we believe there to be a linear positive or negative relationship to a prosodic element and trust. I demonstrate that this assumption may not be entirely accurate for every prosodic element studied. Future work should explore these relationships a bit more in depth to determine the genuine interaction between each prosodic element and the perception of trust. So the question posed initially in this thesis, do prosodic elements of speech influence the perception of trustworthiness given to United States politicians, has been challenged by the three experiments. By using real-world samples, we had the additional challenge of ruling out semantic content and noisy backgrounds as confounding variables that may influence raters' perceptions unknowingly. Although many prosodic elements of speech were found to be statistically significant in both Experiment 1 and Experiment 2, the only prosodic element to show a strong correlation in both studies was the standard deviation or pitch modulation throughout the soundbite. When evaluating this metric with extra governors from the pilot study and the 4 famous speeches from prominent historical figures, we saw that this correlation withstood these additional data points, and we saw an even stronger trend emerge. The uncanny valley was discussed, as well as the preacher cluster, within the final 2 figures examining their presence in rehearsed narrative and the effect on perceived trust. Although standard deviation was found to hold true for these studies, future studies in political psychology and vocal trust literature should make note of this uncanny valley in this specific prosodic element and examine relationships a bit closer when estimating vocal trust perception. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you learned something about vocal analysis through this work. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to ping me on my Twitter, which is in the description. And whenever and wherever you're listening to this at, I hope you create a great day for yourself, and please be kind to others around you because that's just simply rad. Peace, and thank you again. Also, I'm applying to grad schools again for like the 3rd time because I don't know what I'm doing with my life, but I would really appreciate if someone would accept me. Thank you so much. These speeches include John F. Kennedy, his inauguration. These speeches include John F. Kennedy, his inauguration. Goddamn. And that was super fun. Great. Yay. I argue that high-stress trust, when it comes to prosodic elements in the voice and trust behaves... I don't know. The only part... With that amount of information being With the amount of... The processing was done to remove extraneous noise that could significantly influence the speaker's vocal profile. God. In terms of vocal profiles for all the governors, I'll probably get the question of, doesn't all this vocal processing alter the individual's voice? So I prepared an example where I'll play the raw audio, then process audio. Okay. Yeah. Instead of 6 sound bites, though, the participant only instead of 6 fuck. Oh my god. Was rated. As opposed to... Oh my god. I hate this. Okay. Why did I decide to do this? Shabam-ba-dum-bum.